Hello everyone. So this is the structure of a cross section of ovary, right? Ovary is actually grayish pink in color, and it is like the shape of an almond, ovoid, right? And it is like, if we talk about the dimension, it is actually 3 centimeters long, and it is like the breadth is around 1.5 to 2 centimeters, and the thickness is around 1 centimeters, right? Now this entire structure is divided, or you can say it as differentiated into 4 portions, right? The outer part, which you can see, I've drawn it with the line. This line is actually the germinal epithelium, right? This is the outermost part. Next is, there is another layer which is Tunica Albuginea, and that acts like a sheath of connective tissue, right? There is another layer which is the cortical layer. As you can see, all the follicles that are present, right? This particular region is the cortical region, the outer region. And there is also a medullary region. Medullary region is the place where there are a number of blood vessels that are present, right? Now, if you remember the structure of the female reproductive organ, there were 2 ovaries on both the side, right? So these ovarian follicles, they mature one by one, alternately in one it develops gradually, and the other, there also it develops alternately. The development of the follicle, the growth of the follicle is alternative into ovaries, right? And it takes place at an interval of 28 days. Now here, as you can see, the primary follicle undergoes transition. The transition is as such that from primordial follicle it will form primary follicle, from primary to secondary follicle, secondary to tertiary, tertiary to Graafian follicle, Graafian to corpus. This gets ruptured. The Graafian follicle gets ruptured, right? As you can see, the structure getting ruptured and the ovum is getting released. Then this ruptured Graafian follicle takes the formation of a corpus hemorrhagic, right? This structure actually proliferates and finally forms into a yellow pigmented structure. That body is called as corpus luteum, as you can see. So this luteum, this yellow pigmented structure, the yellow color is because of lutein. So that structure is actually corpus luteum, and it helps in secretion of progesterone as well as a small amount of estrogen also. Now this corpus luteum gets degenerated. Actually, before it gets into degeneration, it loses color. This corpus luteum, it loses color and it forms corpus albicans. This structure actually gets degenerated finally. The oogenesis is actually the process of formation of development and maturation. Oogenesis is formation, development and maturation of the ova, right, from the germinal cells. Now this process begins in the fetal condition. Early fetal condition only, within early fetal conditions only the process begins. But it is seen that around 2 millions of primordial follicle develops, but 50% of that gets degenerated, and around 60,000 to 80,000 of such primary follicles actually mature, and then it follows 3 phases: multiplication, growth and maturation, right? Now multiplication is that particular part of the phase where the germ cells, which are actually diploid, they multiply mitotically. So mitosis continues in primary germ cell, that is diploid. and finally those cells form oogonia. Now this oogonia undergoes the second phase, which is the developmental phase. Now the developmental phase or the growth phase is actually time taking, it is slow, and it is seen that the oogonia forms rounded mass like structure, right? And then it becomes functional primary oocyte, and it is seen that the covering of that follicular structure of cell provides nourishment to the oocyte, right? There is also a presence of glycoproteinous membrane around the primary oocyte and follicular cells, and that is called as Zona pellucida. We'll also see the structure simultaneously. The last phase is actually the maturation phase, where meiotic division takes place, meiosis occurs, and due to this meiosis, it is the primary oocyte which was developing. The primary oocyte undergoes meiotic division to form a secondary oocyte, and the secondary oocyte finally, the primary oocyte divides into secondary oocyte, and in that oocyte there is also a polar body. That is the first, what happens during this maturation phase, as I said, that the primary oocyte undergoes division. The division is not equal, and because of that there is a large secondary oocyte which is formed along with a small meiosis. That means here during the growth it was primary follicle which was primary oocyte which was present, right? The primary oocyte is diploid, so during maturation the diploid becomes haploid, right? The primary oocyte becomes secondary oocyte. So two nuclei are present right now. One nuclei acting as the secondary oocyte, and the second nuclei forms the polar body, right? So this is the division where the primary oocyte ends up in a secondary oocyte and also a small polar body, which is first polar body. Now the ovum is actually released as secondary oocyte, right? When it is released as secondary oocyte. But we have to also keep in mind that there are two factors which are also important to continue the fertilization process. Those two factors are MPF and APF. MPF is actually metaphase promoting factor, and APF is anaphase promoting factor. So as this stage is released, secondary oocyte stage is released, two factors are required. So that is metaphase promoting factor, which gets degenerated and undergo activation of anaphase promoting factor. If we come to the part of hormones that are involved, again like that of spermatogenesis, here also hormones are involved, and it is seen that gonadotropin releasing hormone, right? Here this gonadotropin releasing hormone gets released from hypothalamus, right? As it gets released, it activates adenohypophysis. It activates adenohypophysis, and this activation is actually because of the reduction, or you may say due to the decrease in the amount of progesterone and estrogen. That is why gonadotropin releasing hormone gets released from hypothalamus, right? It activates adenohypophysis, and undergoes secretion of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Now, follicle stimulating hormone stimulates ovarian follicle growth, right? So as the ovarian follicle keeps on growing, ultimately growth leads to the formation of Graafian follicle. Graafian follicle releases estrogen. Estrogen in return inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone. I repeat once again, gonadotropin releasing hormone that releases follicle stimulating hormone, and follicle stimulating, as it stimulates the growth of ovarian follicle, it secretes estrogen, and estrogen inhibits gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now I come to the other part of this secretion, luteinizing hormone. Now luteinizing hormone along with estrogen matures, helps in the maturation of Graafian follicle, and then this Graafian follicle moves towards the surface of the ovary, and finally it releases the ovum, right? And as you have seen, within the ovary, the ruptured Graafian follicle ultimately forms corpus luteum. Remember that? So corpus luteum produces progesterone, right? And this progesterone again inhibits luteinizing hormone, right? Now, as we have already seen, the transition of primary follicle to secondary follicle, secondary to tertiary, this is the exact structure of the tertiary follicle, right? This is the structure of the tertiary follicle. Now, if you see the structure closely, the tertiary follicle is having granulosa cells present all around the structure. These are all granulosa cells, right? And these granulosa cells secrete fluids having growth factors, then some steroid hormones. They secrete, and ultimately a small cavity is formed, which is known as antrum, right? This is the structure of the tertiary follicle. So this antrum is formed due to the secretion of the granulosa cells, right? And it is also seen that as this structure, you can see the upper part of the layer is formed of theca externa. So here the theca gets divided into externa and theca interna, right? Here you can see the structure of Zona pellucida. Zona pellucida is nothing but a glycoprotein rich layer, right? Inside this we have our primary oocyte, which is still going to get formed into secondary oocyte after the maturation process. So the primary oocyte is still present in this condition within the zona pellucida, right? And if we just focus on to the Graafian follicle, here also you will find the structure is almost same. The theca externa present externally, followed by theca interna, and there is also the cavity which by now has become bigger, and you can see the granulosa cells are also present here, right? And there is also the presence of zona pellucida around the primary oocyte. There is also a structure which is called as corona radiata throughout or covering the entire primary oocyte, corona radiata, right? And there is also a stalk-like structure which is formed at the base, and that is called as cumulus ophurus. It is at one point where the granulosa cells get thickened like a stalk, right? And that is called as cumulus ophurus. So with this we come to the end of the entire oogenesis process. Thank you.